Greetings, traveler. You've found your way back to the Silver Quill Corner. I am Grayfin, the Story Keeper. Long ago, when I was but a house elf bound to an ancient wizarding family, I learned that stories carry more magic than even the strongest spells. When I was freed, I gathered those tales, whispers of Hogwarts, legends of witches and wizards, and dreams woven through the ages. Tonight, as the wind curls against the windows and the candles burn low, let us journey together into this tale. The story of Severus Snape begins far from magic's glittering heart, not in the marble halls of Gringotts or under the vaulted ceilings of Hogwarts, but in a street most wizards would never set foot upon. A street where soot clung to the brick like a second skin, where the chimneys no longer smoked but still stained the sky grey, and where the only sound was the groan of old pipes and the whisper of the river winding sluggishly nearby. This was Spinner's End. The houses here were narrow and nearly identical, pressed shoulder to shoulder like tired men leaning for support. Curtains sagged in the windows, gardens overrun with nettles and cracked paving stones. The air itself seemed heavy, carrying the smell of oil, rust, and a faint bitterness that had seeped into every wall. In the last house of this row, at the end of a lane overgrown with weeds, lived a boy who would one day shape the fate of the wizarding world. Severus Snape was born into a house that knew little joy. His father, Tobias, was an ordinary man in the truest sense, a muggle hardened by disappointment. He had married a witch without truly understanding what that meant, and bitterness had taken root when he realized her magic could not banish poverty nor conjure away the dreariness of their lives. His frustrations spilled into anger and his anger into drink. Eileen, Severus's mother, had once been part of the old wizarding family of Prince. Though never wealthy, the princes were respectable, their name carrying centuries of magical tradition. But her love for Tobias had cost her everything. By the time her son was old enough to notice, her voice had grown quiet, her eyes tired, her wand often resting forgotten on a shelf. Yet, despite the weight of her regrets, she remained his first connection to magic. The Snape household was cramped, its thin walls leaking sound from one room to another. Severus quickly learned to listen closely, to the sharpness in his father's footsteps on the stairs, to the sigh in his mother's voice when she set down her teacup. These were signals, warnings, that told him when to hide in his small room or when it was safe to creep into the garden. That garden, overgrown and neglected, became his first sanctuary. On rare good days, Eileen would kneel among the weeds with him, pointing out the stubborn herbs that still grew wild, dittany, knot grass, the bitter leaves of wormwood. She would whisper their properties, not as lessons, but as secrets, and Severus would store every word carefully in his memory. He did not yet understand how important those lessons would become. Magic revealed itself to Severus in moments of raw feeling. One night, as voices rose downstairs and glass shattered, he squeezed his eyes shut in desperation, wishing only to escape. Suddenly, he found himself standing in the garden, but not the garden as it was. The weeds had parted. Flowers glowed in impossible colors, their petals shifting as though alive. The air was warm with the scent of honey and rain. Just as suddenly, it was gone, and he was back in the dark cupboard under the stairs. But the memory lingered. He had touched something real, something powerful. Unlike his father, he was not powerless. Unlike his mother, he was not resigned. He was different. As the years passed, this difference became both his shield and his burden. Other children noticed it too. They mocked his thin frame, his ill-fitting clothes, his hair that never seemed clean no matter how often it was washed. But when stones thrown in cruel games veered suddenly away, or when whispers seemed to follow him in the wind, those same children grew uneasy. They could not name what was wrong about him, but they knew he was not like them. Books became his refuge. The town's small library smelled of dust and paper, but there, no one cared about his second-hand clothes. He read everything he could find, myths that hinted at hidden truths, science books that attempted to explain a world he knew was stranger than their authors believed, and old histories that spoke in riddles. Knowledge became a kind of armor. If he could understand the rules of the world, perhaps he could bend them. By the time he was 9, his powers were more than accidental flickers. He could direct them. Objects moved at his will. Shadows seemed to curl where he wanted them. Water rippled against gravity when he whispered to it. The thrill of control, however small, became his obsession. For a boy raised in chaos, mastery was intoxicating. But magic could not fix everything. It could not soften his father's temper. It could not restore the brightness in his mother's face. It could not fill the cupboards when money was gone, and it could not make him less of an outsider. Still, Severus clung to it. He practiced alone in abandoned corners of the town, the silent mill, the railway cutting, the playground where rusted swings creaked in the wind. Each secret success tightened the belief within him that magic was his escape, his way forward, his proof that he was not destined to remain in the grey world of Spinner's End. As he lay awake at night, listening to the arguments fade into silence, he would imagine Hogwarts. His mother had spoken of it like a place of wonder, floating candles, endless feasts, a library larger than he could dream. A place where boys like him were not strange, but chosen. Each story planted in him a hope that grew fiercer the more the outside world rejected him. In Spinner's End, Severus Snape was a poor, odd boy with nothing to his name, but in his dreams he was already something greater. And so the first chapter of his life closed, with a child hidden in the shadows of a failing town, clutching secret knowledge, clinging to his gift, and waiting for the day when the world would finally open its doors to him. Severus Snape's world had always been painted in shades of grey. The smoke of Spinner's End, the dull skies above the river, the silence of a house where love had long ago withered. And then came Lily. It was the summer before their Hogwarts years when their paths first crossed. Severus was wandering the neglected outskirts of town, drawn to the abandoned playground where rusted swings creaked in the wind. This was one of his secret places, a place where he practiced control over the strange surges of magic that pulsed inside him. Small stones rose and hovered at his command, circling in careful patterns as he concentrated. That's when he heard it. Laughter. Not cruel or mocking, but bright and clear, like sunlight piercing through clouds. Startled, he let the stones drop with tiny clicks on the pavement. Turning, he saw her. A girl about his age with flame-red hair that caught the evening light and eyes the color of green glass warmed by summer. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even surprised. She was fascinated. Lily Evans had always known she was different. Flowers bloomed where her hands touched them. Toys seemed to spring to life, and her sister grew more unsettled each time it happened. For years she had been told to hush, to be careful, to stop pretending. And yet here, in the middle of this forgotten playground, was a boy who spoke of magic as if it were not something to be hidden, but something wondrous. Severus showed her what he could do, how shadows bent to his will, how leaves turned in the still air as if dancing. He spoke of Hogwarts with a fervor that came from whispered lessons with his mother. He described moving staircases, portraits that talked, ghosts who lingered in the halls. Each word lit Lily's face with astonishment. For the first time in his life, Severus felt the sharp edges of his world soften. Someone saw him not as a freak or a threat, but as something extraordinary. Their friendship grew in secret, stitched together in stolen afternoons. They walked through the narrow lanes of their town, through through the thickets beyond the houses, whispering about the life that awaited them. Severus taught her the bits of magical lore he had gathered, the names of wizarding families, the difference between charms and transfiguration, the etiquette of a world she had never known existed. Lily listened with eagerness, her curiosity boundless. For Lily, this strange boy became a guide to the world she was only just discovering. For Severus, she was something even more powerful: acceptance. Her laughter filled spaces that had always been empty. Her presence was a warmth he had never known. In her eyes, he was not the poor, awkward child of Spinner's End. He was a wizard. He was someone worth knowing. But even in those golden afternoons, shadows lingered. Lily's sister, Petunia, noticed the bond between them. Where Lily saw wonder, Petunia saw danger. She mocked Severus, called him names and whispered warnings to their parents. One day, her jealously broke into open fury. She confronted them, her voice shrill with anger, calling them unnatural. Severus, too young to control his temper, lashed out with magic that struck too close. The damage was small, but the scar it left on Lily's family was deep. From that moment, their friendship became something that had to be hidden. Lily lied to her parents, slipped away from Petunia's watchful eyes, while Severus learned to approach the Evans home like a thief, always careful, always in secret. Yet neither of them could let go. The bond had grown too strong. It was in these moments of secrecy that their promises were made. Childish vows whispered beneath trees or under the cover of twilight. They swore they would always be friends. They swore they would stand by one another, no matter what the future brought. Severus clung to those words like a lifeline because he had nothing else to cling to. As the summer waned, letters arrived, heavy parchment bearing the crest of Hogwarts. Both children held them in trembling hands, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was real. Everything Severus had spoken of, everything Lily had dreamed of, was real. They would go together. They would step into that magical world side by side. On the night before they left, they met once more in the playground where it had all begun. The swings creaked softly, the stars blinked faint above the haze. They spoke little, both lost in thought, but Severus felt something he had never felt before: hope. A future that was brighter than Spinner's End, brighter than the grey silence of his home. A future where magic would be more than fleeting sparks. For Lily, it was the beginning of a new adventure. For Severus, it was the beginning of everything. The morning air at King's Cross was cool and bright, carrying with it the restless excitement of hundreds of families. Steam from the scarlet train rolled in waves across the platform, curling around trunks and owls and the laughter of children about to begin the most important journey of their lives. For Severus, platform 9 3/4 was overwhelming. He had dreamed of this day for years, clinging to every whispered description from his mother. But reality was bigger, louder, and far more dazzling. Wizards in long robes bustled past, cats twined through ankles, and magical sweets were already being hawked by cheerful vendors. In the midst of it all stood Lily, her eyes alight, her family clustered uncertainly nearby. She looked radiant, her red hair like a flame in the morning sun, her smile wide as she waved him over. For a moment, Severus forgot the grey world of Spinner's End. He forgot his patched clothes and the heaviness of his father's shadow. All he saw was Lily and the hope that had carried him this far. The train whistled, a deep and thrilling sound, and together they boarded. The long corridor was crowded with chattering students, but they found an empty compartment and slid inside. For a little while, it was just as they had promised, side by side, faces pressed to the glass as the countryside blurred past. They whispered about lessons, about houses, about the castle that awaited them. Severus's heart swelled with certainty. Whatever else happened, they would face it together. But the Hogwarts Express was also the place where new alliances began to form. James Potter bounded into the corridor, messy-haired and grinning, already brimming with confidence. Behind him followed Sirius Black, every inch of him steeped in aristocratic pride, though his smirk suggested rebellion. Remus Lupin, quiet and pale, carried himself with gentleness that contrasted sharply with his friends. Even Peter Pettigrew, smaller and more timid, clung to them as though he already knew his place. Severus watched from the compartment door as Lily exchanged polite nods with them. A coil of unease twisted in his stomach. Something about their swagger, their laughter, the way they filled the space as if it belonged to them. It all set his teeth on edge. Lily herself looked unimpressed, frowning slightly at James's arrogance, as though she had already judged him and found him lacking. By the time the train slowed and the castle loomed in the distance, a shift had already begun. The sorting ceremony that night filled Severus with a tension so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against his chest. The great hall was breathtaking, thousands of floating candles, a ceiling enchanted to mirror the night sky, and the murmur of hundreds of students waiting to see where each new arrival would be placed. One by one, names were called. When Lily stepped forward, Severus's heart thudded. The Sorting Hat barely hesitated before sending her to Gryffindor. Cheers erupted from the red and gold table as Lily joined them, her face glowing with pride. She turned to look for him, smiling, but Severus felt the first sting of something cold and painful. Gryffindor, of course. When his turn came, he lowered himself onto the stool and felt the Sorting Hat slip down over his eyes. It spoke of ambition, of talent, of the sharp hunger that drove him. There was a moment, a fleeting suggestion, that he might belong in Gryffindor, that his bravery could carry him there. But Severus rejected it fiercely. He clung to the house his mother had spoken of with pride. Slytherin. It was his choice, his demand, and the hat obliged. Applause rose from the Slytherin table, polite and reserved. Severus crossed the hall, his new house colours already feeling like a wall between him and Lily. She caught his gaze, gave him a smile meant to reassure, but all he felt was distance. The feast that followed was a blur of food and chatter. At the Slytherin table, older students leaned in with calculating eyes, measuring the new arrivals. Severus nodded, murmured, tried to fit in, but his attention kept drifting to the Gryffindors. There was Lily, proud, radiant, but now among people who had already shown disdain for him. That night, when he lay in the green-lit dormitory beneath the lake, he should have felt triumphant. He had made it. He was at Hogwarts, a Slytherin, a wizard at last. Yet all he felt was the weight of a choice that had already begun to divide him from the only person who made this world feel like home. The first days at Hogwarts felt like walking inside a dream. The staircases shifted softly underfoot, carrying students to places they hadn't meant to go. Portraits whispered among themselves when they thought no one was listening. At night, the great lake shimmered silver beneath the moon, its surface rippling as though something vast moved just below. In the dungeons, the air smelled of stone and candle wax. At the long table of green and silver, older students watched the newcomers with quiet, measuring eyes. Their welcome was polite but cool, as if weighing who might one day be of use. The boy from Spinner's End found his footing quickly in lessons. In potions, the rhythm of chopping roots, the slow swirl of a simmering brew, the gentle hiss of steam, all of it came easily to him. A perfectly brewed draught glowed in his cauldron, and for a fleeting moment he felt the rare warmth of belonging. Professor Slughorn praised him, though his enthusiasm burned brighter for Lily, whose charm drew admiration like a flame draws moths. That contrast stung. She was pulled into the orbit of the Slug Club, her laughter carrying across the Gryffindor table. He remained in the shadows, sharpening his skill in silence. In defense against the dark arts, he was quick, faster than most, absorbing jinxes and counterspells like water soaking into stone. Sparks fizzled in the air, whispers trailed behind him. The quiet boy who knew curses too sharp for his age, the Slytherin who could outmatch even older students. Admiration, yes, but edged with unease. And always James Potter. The Gryffindor's smile carried crowds with it. Quidditch fans, friends, admirers who laughed at every joke. But whenever his eyes fell on the boy in the dungeons, that smile sharpened. Taunts came easily, clothes too worn, hair too greasy, books too strange. Sirius laughed beside him, the sound ringing against stone walls. Through it all, Lily tried to stand between them. She reminded James that cruelty was beneath him, and told her oldest friend to ignore the Gryffindor, to rise above. But bitterness sat heavy, and the gap widened. So the boy turned inward. In the library's golden hush, he bent over battered textbooks, filling the margins with notes, crossing out lines, testing new combinations. The faint scratch of his quill, the rustle of pages, the flicker of candlelight, these became his sanctuary. Here he could not be mocked. Here he was in control. Sometimes, when the castle had fallen to silence, he wandered the corridors alone. His footsteps echoed gently on stone, his wand casting a pool of light that swayed with every movement. A chill draft from the windows brushed against his face, carrying the scent of old stone and distant rain. The castle seemed endless, secretive, almost alive, as if it, at least, understood him. For Lily, Hogwarts was warmth, friendship, and laughter. For him, it was already something different. A place of brilliance and rejection, of whispers and shadows. A place where the line between light and dark was beginning to blur. The first chill of autumn crept through the castle. Fires crackled in every common room, their smoke curling faintly into the rafters. In Gryffindor Tower, music and laughter spilled past the portrait hole, warm as honey. In the dungeons, the flames burned lower, their green glow rippling across damp stone walls like light beneath water. For one quiet boy, lessons became both sanctuary and battlefield. In potions, he thrived. The steady rhythm of chopping roots, the soft swirl of a spoon, the gentle simmer of a brew, it all came as naturally to him as breathing. Professor Slughorn would pause by his cauldron, nodding with quiet approval at how effortlessly he coaxed magic from ingredients others ruined. For a moment, as steam rose like silver mist, he felt almost at peace. But peace never lasted long. In defense against the dark arts, the air was sharper. James Potter, wand always half-drawn, grin bright and cruel, seemed determined to make him the butt of every joke. Sirius joined with laughter that rang through the vaulted room, while Lupin watched but rarely interfered. One afternoon, as the class practiced simple disarming charms, James flicked his wand and sent books scattering across the floor. Sirius's laugh echoed like a whip crack. Heat rose in the boy's cheeks, his fingers tightening around his wand, an unfamiliar curse already pressing at the edge of his tongue. But before it could escape, Lily's voice. "Stop it." Her tone was steady, firm enough to silence even James for a breath. She bent to gather the scattered books, the hush of her robes brushing stone, parchment scraping softly against the floor. Those small sounds lingered far longer in his mind than the jeers. That night, he buried the sting in ink. In the library's golden hush, he scratched notes into battered margins, experimenting where others dared not. A drop of moondew here, a slower stir there. The scratch of quill, the flicker of candlelight, the faint scent of ink and dust. These became a rhythm, steady enough to drown out the echo of laughter. And yet, Lily's kindness cut both ways. She was kind to him, yes, unwaveringly so. But her warmth stretched beyond him, shared with Gryffindors, even with James at times. It wasn't betrayal, not truly, but it gnawed at him. He longed for her light only for himself. The first Quidditch match deepened the ache. James soared on his broom as though the sky belonged to him, The stands erupted, red and gold banners whipping in the wind. From the shadows, the boy watched Lily cheer with the crowd, her hair catching the pale autumn sun. The roar of the game, the thud of bludgers, the rush of wind, it was a world he could never touch. Back in the dungeons, whispers wound around him like smoke. Older Slytherins leaned close, voices low, speaking of heritage, of power, of Gryffindor's flaunting arrogance without consequence. Lucius Malfoy, polished and persuasive, told him ambition sometimes demanded hard choices, and so, two worlds pulled at him. In the library, at Lily's side, there was quiet and almost wholeness. But in the common room beneath the lake, with green firelight shimmering against the glass and the murmur of ambition in his ears, there was strength. The year moved on, and the choice between them blurred. Winter deepened at Hogwarts, muffling the castle in a strange hush. The snow piled high on the turrets and drifted across the black lake in quiet sheets, while beneath the stone, green light rippled in the Slytherin dormitories, as though the lake itself pressed close to listen. In that stillness, whispers began to spread about the boy in the shadows. He was seen too often in the library, hunched over old texts until the candles guttered low. He lingered in forgotten classrooms, where desks were pushed aside and sparks scorched black marks into stone. Others said his duels were merciless, ending not with laughter, but with opponents gasping, wands clattering across the floor. Dueling had become its own underground pastime. Corridors after curfew and abandoned classrooms thrummed with it. Students circling, muttering bets, hexes snapping through the air. Most flung the spells they'd been taught in class, but not him. His words were clipped Latin fragments, pieced together from the margins of books too dusty for others to touch. His wand burned with pale green or silver light, colors that unsettled even seventh years. These weren't schoolyard jinxes. They were something else, something darker, and he was alone in it. He always had been. He was brilliant, yes, but withdrawn. He spoke little in class except when answering questions with unnerving accuracy. In the common room, he sat at the edge of the firelight, listening more than he spoke. Even among Slytherins, he was marked as different, admired by some, avoided by most. Only Lucius Malfoy and his circle leaned in close, murmuring that he had rare talent, that his abilities could open doors. For the first time in his life, praise came not with pity, but with respect. Yet he could not forget the smirks, the whispers, the snide nickname James Potter had hissed across the great hall, Snivelus. James had a talent for cruelty cloaked in charm. His friends, Sirius Black with his bark of laughter, Remus Lupin with quiet complicity, Peter Pettigrew tagging nervously along, had begun to call themselves the Marauders. They thrived on mischief, adored by Gryffindor, feared by those in their way, and James, with his messy hair and careless grin, seemed to delight in mocking the boy in the shadows. Severus Snape, he'd call, loud enough for a whole courtyard to hear. The shame festered, and so he began to shape a new name for himself. Not the weak muggle surname of a bitter father, nor the narrow life it tied him to. In his notebooks, in ink blotted by candlelight, he scrawled the words again and again, the half-blood prince. It was an identity forged of pride and rejection, the heritage of his mother's line and the acknowledgement of his mixed blood twisted into power. If the world would sneer at half-blood, then he would wear it as armor. That book became more than parchment and ink. It was a secret diary of invention. In the margins, he tested small alterations to potions, a counter-stir here, an added drop of moon dew there, until his brews shimmered with more potency than any recipe allowed. Between potion notes, he carved new spells into existence. Levicorpus, a charm that hoisted its victim upside down, leaving them flailing helplessly. Muffliato, a charm that filled ears with buzzing, silencing private conversations. And hidden deeper in those pages, Sectum Sempra, a spell for enemies, a slashing curse, cruel and precise. He never dared unleash it openly, but the thought of it thrummed like a secret weapon waiting in his hand. There was something else too, a skill he did not fully understand, yet felt tugging at him in certain moments, the ability to sense thoughts not spoken, to push into the corners of another mind, legilimency. In arguments, in duels, he could almost anticipate his opponent's next move, as though he had plucked it from their intent before their wand moved. It unsettled him, but it also thrilled him. And still, Lily hovered at the edges of his world. She saw the flashes of light, the two sharp spells, the way his eyes seemed to darken when James sneered across the courtyard. She tried to reach him, reminding him he didn't need to fight this way, didn't need to chase the shadows. But her voice, soft with worry, grated against the laughter echoing in his memory. James's laughter, Sirius's jeers, the chant of Snivelus that never seemed to end. So he turned away from her warmth, step by step. He told himself it was not rejection, only necessity. Better to be feared than mocked. Better to invent, to control, to master. That winter, beneath the flicker of torches and the creak of the castle settling against the snow, he was no longer just a lonely boy. He was building something, an identity, a book, a power that no one could strip from him. The marauders laughed louder, their pranks sharper. But in the shadows, the half-blood prince was writing his own legacy, and Hogwarts itself seemed to whisper with unease. Spring returned to Hogwarts with a restlessness the castle seemed unable to contain. The snow melted from the Black Lake, its waters gleaming beneath brighter skies, while the forbidden forest stirred with the whisper of new leaves and the scent of damp earth. Students spilled into the courtyards, their laughter echoing across stone walls, but beneath the lightness, tension rippled like an unseen current. Severus had grown leaner, taller, his presence sharper in torchlight. His reputation had spread beyond whispers. Students knew better now than to challenge him lightly. Duels ended quickly when he was involved. His wand struck fast, his words clipped and sure, and more than once it seemed as though he anticipated his opponent's move before it was made. It was as though the thoughts of others hovered just within his reach, waiting to be plucked, a gift he did not yet name, but one that set him further apart. Meanwhile, the marauders grew bolder. James Potter and Sirius Black thrived in the center of every crowd, their laughter carrying across the lawns like a challenge, their mischief celebrated by Gryffindor House. Even Remus Lupin, quieter, more reluctant, stood at their side, his silence a tacit agreement. Only Peter Pettigrew seemed nervous, though his eagerness to belong bound him to them all the tighter. Together, they moved like a unit, adored and untouchable, feeding off each other's daring. And always, they found ways to remind Severus of his place in their world. A shove in the corridor, a jinx cast for the amusement of onlookers, the roar of laughter at his expense. Their rivalry had become part of the rhythm of the school, so well known that students paused in their steps whenever the two sides clashed. Slytherin against Gryffindor, bitterness against pride. Lily felt the strain more keenly than anyone. She still walked beside him sometimes in the library, the soft scratch of quills between them, but her eyes carried unease now. She had seen the way his spells lingered too long, the way certain older Slytherins watched him with approval. She still cared, but her warmth came with a hesitation that wounded him more deeply than her words. "You're better than this," she whispered once, her hair catching the last streaks of sunlight by the lake. For a fleeting moment, he wanted to believe her. But the memory of jeering laughter rose quickly, hardening his voice. Power is the only thing that keeps them from grinding you into the dirt. Her silence in reply lingered longer than any argument. The castle itself seemed to feel the growing division. Hexes flared more often in corridors, professors' voices grew sharp with weariness, and even the common rooms buzzed with talk of feuds. It was no longer just a rivalry, it was a climate, a tension woven into the stones of Hogwarts itself. And in that restless spring, the storm edged closer. The day was coming when bitterness and pride would collide in full view of the school. The sun was warm that afternoon, spilling across the black lake in golden sheets. The grass shimmered with light, soft under the weight of cloaks and satchels scattered carelessly by students who had just finished their exams. Laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the lazy hum of bees and the gentle lap of water against the bank. Severus had found refuge beneath a willow tree. His knees were drawn up, a heavy book balanced across them, quill scratching steadily in the margins. In the dappled shade, with the rustle of leaves above him, he could almost forget the world outside the page. For a few moments, there was peace, but shadows fell across his parchment, blotting out the sun. James Potter's voice followed soon after, smug, effortless, meant to be overheard. Sirius Black lounged at his side with a smirk, while Remus lingered just behind, uneasy, and Peter Pettigrew scurried to keep up. The taunts came easily, his clothes, his hair, the way he always slipped into corners with his nose in a book. Severus ignored them at first, quill pressing harder into the parchment, jaw tight. But James thrived on an audience, and there was one here, a circle of students already watching. With a lazy flick of his wand, James lifted Severus off the ground. The world spun as he was hurled upside down, robes falling toward his face. The grass, the crowd, the lake, all of it turned sickeningly in circles. Laughter broke out, loud and cruel, echoing across the water. Sirius's cackling was sharpest of all, carrying like a whip through the summer air. Students pressed closer, jeering. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun overhead. Severus's cheeks flamed, his heart hammering. He struggled, but the magic held, a mockery of his helplessness. And then Lily's voice. It cut clean through the laughter, bright and furious. She pushed to the front, wand in hand, her green eyes blazing. For a single heartbeat, even James faltered, grin slipping as she demanded he stop. She was his shield, the only one who had ever stood between him and the world. But anger and shame boiled together in Severus's chest, bitter and blinding. Before he could think, the word was out, sharp, venomous, and cruel. It hung in the air like a curse, far worse than any spell. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even James fell silent. Lily's face changed instantly, shock, then hurt, then something colder than anger. Slowly, she lowered her wand. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. And then she turned, red hair catching the sunlight as she walked away without another word. The spell broke, and Severus crashed onto the grass. The laughter returned, but it no longer mattered. The ache in his chest was louder than any jeer. He had not lost her to James, nor to Gryffindor, but to his own bitterness. That night, under the green glow of the Slytherin dormitory, he lay awake. His housemates whispered of ambition and power, their voices curling like smoke through the dark. But all he could see was Lily's back as she left him behind. And so the fracture widened, deep and final. Hogwarts would never be the same again. Beyond this fracture lies a story of ambition, secrets, and the choices that shaped the man history would call the Half-Blood Prince. In Part 2, we'll step deeper into those shadows together. If this tale brought you rest tonight, leave a like to keep the fire burning. And subscribe, traveler, so when Part 2 arrives, it will find you.